April 18, 1945. Lohe, outskirts of Nuremberg. In the morning, the hillside ahead shook under the bursts of MG-42 sweeping down on the American formation. Two German machine gun nests held the high ground, locking down the axis of advance, instantly cutting down any soldier who raised his head above the ground. The platoon lay scattered across the slope, casualties mounting by the minute, every approach choked by dense fire. Joseph F. Merrell, 18 years old, pressed himself against a low mound of earth. From his position, he could clearly see the tracers from the two nests slicing the battlefield in half, keeping the Americans pinned in a passive state, unable to retreat, far less able to advance. His hands gripped the M1 tightly as he watched the rhythm of the German fire, the thin gaps so narrow, no one would dare think they could be exploited. Merrell stared straight into them. He knew exactly where the task lay. If no one knocked out those two nests, the entire platoon would be wiped out on the Lohe hillside. Without waiting for orders, he pushed off the ground and charged forward. Bullets whipped past on both sides, but Merrell kept running, weaving to dodge the streams of fire, closing on the targets. Those behind him only caught glimpses of a young soldier sprinting straight into the German fire. That was the moment the fight truly began. Merrell alone charging through the web of bullets to destroy two Nazi machine gun nests. And to understand why an 18-year-old boy would choose to run straight into the heart of death, we must start where he grew up. Joseph Frederick Merrell was born in 1926 on Staten Island, in a working-class family accustomed to the lean years of the Great Depression. His childhood held nothing remarkable except constant hardship. His parents worked from dawn to dusk, trading labor for just enough money to cover rent and put food on the table. He grew up in a small apartment with sparse furnishings, meals sometimes consisting only of what could be bought with the day's final wages. Yet in that struggle, Merrell learned to care for others. He often helped neighbors carry groceries, fixed minor broken things around the block, pushed carts for the little corner grocery store. No one told him to. Merrell simply felt it was the right thing to do. As he grew older, his parents taught him a principle they regarded as the family's guiding rule: if you can take the heavier load for someone else, you must be ready to do it. Merrell heard it so often that it became part of how he saw the world. Then the war came. Older young men in the neighborhood began leaving for service. The moment he turned 18, Merrell voluntarily enlisted. To him it was not a bold or noble choice, but simply the next step in the lesson of his childhood: when the country needs you, you step into the line. And that simple foundation shaped the man who would face the fire at Lohe. Merrell joined the 3rd Infantry Division in late 1944, and was almost immediately thrown into the brutal flow of the war advancing toward the heart of Germany. From Staten Island to Europe, he stepped into a world shrouded in gray smoke, the clash of steel and towns reduced to blackened walls. His first days in Lorraine opened his eyes in the most direct way. Skies choked with haze, trees snapped flat, village roads torn open by artillery. Every advance meant facing the whine of machine guns and explosions hurling earth and stone over snow. The 3rd Infantry moved constantly, from one forest to the next, then into abandoned villages with streets lined by windowless houses. Merrell quickly learned the battlefield, waited for no one to adjust. In Lorraine, during a march through a narrow valley, German mortar rounds landed directly on the column. A young soldier walking beside him was thrown aside by a single sharp blast. No cry, no words, just a collapse into silence. That scene carved itself into Merrell's mind like the first cut war makes on an 18-year-old soldier. As the unit crossed rivers and pushed into the Saar, the atmosphere grew heavier. This was hard German defensive ground, thick with bunkers and machine gun positions. Industrial streets coated in coal dust, every corner potentially hiding a sniper. The 3rd Infantry advanced meter by meter, clearing every door, every hallway. For days on end, Merrell heard artillery until his ears rang at night. In one fight on the outskirts of Saarbrücken, the Germans counterattacked with concentrated fire from concrete emplacements. The platoon hugged the pavement, crossing intersections as dusk fell, and just as they shifted position, a grenade round struck the wall to their left. The group was thrown backward, A veteran sergeant lost half his hand. Merrell helped drag him rearward, feeling hot blood soak through his sleeve. The smell of blood, gunpowder, shattered concrete hit him full in the face. This was when he understood the battlefield operated by a clear rule. Hesitate 1 second, and you lose men. Moving into Bavaria, the 3rd Infantry no longer faced the deliberate fighting of the Saar. Here the Germans withdrew in clusters, fighting delaying actions, mining roads, blocking passes, blowing bridges, cobblestone streets torn open, stairways collapsed into rubble, windows blown out, power lines dangling in the wind. Every town bore the marks of a battle fought hours earlier. Merrell and his comrades pushed deeper, crossing freezing valleys where every remaining house was shuttered, every road empty. They slept in cow barns, abandoned wine cellars, on the damp edges of forests. Mornings on the march, mud reached their ankles. He grew used to treating each day as a new test. On a bad weather day near Augsburg, the column was pinned by sniper fire from the 2nd floor of a shattered house. A soldier ahead dropped the moment he leaned around a wall. Merrell pulled him into cover without seeing his face. No one lingered. They cleared the house, secured the ground floor, then moved on. He could not even recall the name of the man who had just fallen beside him. War compressed memory into chaotic fragments. The slap of boots on stone, the dry click of rounds chambered, panic calls, medics signaling for more stretcher bearers. Day after day the faces in the platoon gradually changed. Some left due to wounds. Some vanished forever around a corner, behind a tree line, after an artillery barrage. Merrell stopped trying to remember names. He focused on the task in front of him, learning to read gun positions, wind direction, the rhythm of enemy shelling. He understood his job was not to think about tomorrow, but to survive the next hour. As the 3rd Infantry approached Nuremberg, Merrell sensed the exhaustion on both sides. The Germans contracted their lines to defensive positions around the city. For the Americans, these final days held none of the lightness of a war nearing its end. They were the last brutal squeeze, the fiercest and heaviest. Every clash was savage, every corner a trap, every decision demanded reflex. Merrell entered Lohe with the mindset of someone who had left behind all the carefree spirit of 18. The battles in Lorraine, the Saar and Bavaria had stripped away every illusion, leaving only the cold clarity of a soldier who knew the battlefield ran on speed and resolve. And when the platoon received orders to assault the Lohe hillside, where 2 MG-42 nests waited to shred any formation that appeared, Merrell understood that everything until now had been preparation for the moment about to arrive, the moment he would have to act before the battlefield chose for him. Morning of April 18, 1945, the 3rd Infantry Division tightened the ring around Nuremberg, and Merrell's platoon was tasked with seizing a small height at Lohe, a hillside that looked insignificant from afar, but sat directly on the unit's axis of advance. From midway up the slope, the ground was open, offering no cover. As soon as the formation spread out, the 2 MG-42 Seeps emplaced at the crest opened fire. Tracers skimmed the surface, forcing every American flat against the slope. The tree line was only a few dozen meters away, but no one could reach it. Anyone who tried to crawl forward was cut down in seconds. The slope became an open grave, and the platoon was locked inside it. The platoon leader took a round the moment he raised his head to observe. The medic rushed forward to drag him back, but had to flatten himself instantly as the MG-42 Sis swung toward them. Each time a gun paused half a beat to change belts, the platoon held its breath, searching for an escape route. But the slope was too exposed, the firing angles too perfect. The Germans held the height with the cold confidence of men who knew they owned absolute advantage. On the ground, Merrell lay pressed against the edge of a small mound, palms digging into the M1 stock, eyes scanning the upper slope for any gap in the enemy rhythm. He saw bodies shoved backward down the hill, saw friends he had spoken to that morning now lying motionless. No one said it aloud, but the entire platoon understood. If those 2 nests were not silenced, they would be crushed right there. The Germans had blocked them at exactly the right point, at exactly the right moment. Thinking of that, Merrell felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from what he was witnessing. Men one by one pinned in the kill zone, unable to be pulled back, unable to move forward. A platoon bound hand and foot by two gun barrels on the crest. Merrell peered over the edge of the mound, tracking the shift of fire. He noticed something critical. The enemy was not spraying wildly. They fired in rhythm, governed by belt vibration, by the tiny pauses when the gun shifted posture or changed boxes. Gaps thin as threads. But to a man trying to find a way out for the whole platoon, they meant everything. He followed the jerk of the first nest, then shifted to the second. Behind him, the ragged breathing of comrades mixed with voices trying to keep the bleeding platoon leader conscious. A younger soldier grabbed Merrell's wrist, as if to stop him from raising his head. But Merrell gently brushed the hand away. He kept watching, kept calculating. At that moment, the battlefield narrowed to a single axis, the MG-42 fire lanes and the way across them. Inside him, another struggle played out. One part wanted to keep his head down like everyone else, to wait for reinforcements, to wait for artillery support or anything that might change the situation. The clearer, colder part reminded him there was no time left. The wounded lay in the open under the guns. The platoon leader would not survive if not pulled down soon, and no one could reach them, except someone willing to run straight up. The thought came fast, clean, like someone tying a rope around his chest and pulling. Merrell felt fear sweep through his body, sharp and real. Fear of being cut down on the first step, fear of being torn apart halfway up the slope, fear of the emptiness when his legs gave out. But beneath that fear was something else, a formless anger at seeing his comrades held helpless, an urge to get them out of the trap the Germans had set. An older soldier had once told him in the Saar that there are moments in war when the body acts before the mind finishes debating. But at Lohe, Merrell knew exactly what he was choosing, and he chose with absolute clarity. He dug his toes into the slick earth, judged the angle of the slope, then silently counted the rhythm of the first MG-42. 1, 2, 3, gap. Merrell coiled like a sprinter, muscles loaded. For one brief instant, his mind grew strangely calm, every explosion receding behind him. Merrell surged forward as the first MG-42 changed belts, his strides driving deep into the soft mud. The distance from the mound to the first open stretch was only a few meters, but it was the deadliest ground, where showing half a body was enough to be knocked down instantly. When the machine gun roared again, he veered left, then cut right, exactly timed to the gunner's correction. The stream of bullets flashed past his shoulder in a bright line, kicking up short spurts of earth, but Merrell maintained speed, pouring everything into closing the widening slope ahead. Those behind saw only the small figure in olive drab tearing through the space between the two fire lanes, each step a blow against the margin of survival. He did not look back. He looked only up. The M1 Garand shook in his hands, from the pounding ground in his pace, and just as he began to raise it to fire, a burst splintered the stock. A hot steel fragment ripped the bolt cover backward, grazing his wrist. He did not pause to check. The M1 was useless. He immediately slid into a shallow depression just below the MG-42's arc, pulled the pin on a grenade clipped to his belt, then popped up for a heartbeat to fix the exact position of the nest. German shouts echoed down with the gun smoke, clarifying the gap between two boulders the Germans had used for cover. Merrell pulled the pin, hurled the grenade straight into that gap, then flattened himself. The explosion flashed blindingly. Rock fragments rained down the slope. Voices cried out in chaos. The first nest fell silent. Without waiting for the smoke to clear, Merrell sprang up and charged onward. He snatched a Luger, lying at the feet of a German soldier just blown from the position, worked the action with a quick wrist flick, then ran along the edge of the emplacement to flank the second MG-42. The distance was now much shorter, but more dangerous, because the Germans had identified his direction. A burst kicked earth up beside his waist, staggering him. Rifle fire from the American platoon below tried to suppress, but most could not reach the second nest because it sat too high. Merrell kept moving, scrambling over two low ridges, then pressed himself against a rock edge near the machine gun. He popped his head up for an instant, fired 3 Luger rounds toward the barrel. The nest's reaction swung fire toward him, creating exactly the opening Merrell needed, the right flank where 2 Germans were reloading again. He did not wait for the fire to slacken. He charged, a burst grazing his side in a hot line of pain, but his legs kept rhythm. At less than 5 meters from the emplacement, a round slammed into his upper arm, buckling him for a moment, but he gritted his teeth, pushed up with his good hand, fired 2 more shots into the loader, then kept squeezing the trigger to force the enemy back. 1 German tried to raise his rifle to aim, but Merrell was close enough to slam his shoulder into the man against the rock, knocking the barrel aside, then shot him at point-blank range. The remaining nest panicked. 1 man leaped out and tried to run up the trail behind. Merrell shifted weight, raised the blood-slick Luger with his wounded arm, and fired repeatedly. The German dropped halfway. Now only 1 remained, the MG-42 gunner, trying to swing the gun toward Merrell. He gave him no chance. Merrell rushed in from the side of the emplacement, sliding half his body along the sloped earth, pressed the Luger barrel against the edge of the machine gun, and fired straight into the darkness behind the mount. Metal clanged down, the belt slipped from the feed tray, and rolled down the slope. When the gunfire finally stopped, the rest of the platoon dared to raise their heads. On the crest, Merrell dropped to 1 knee, body pitching forward, hands still gripping the empty pistol. Both MG-42s were silent. Around him lay the acrid smell of grenade smoke, shattered rock, and 3 dead Germans scattered in the emplacement. Merrell's breathing came in ragged bursts, each rise of his chest pulling pain from shoulder to side. Blood soaked through his jacket, running along rain tracks still on the stones. But he held his back straight a moment longer, as if to make certain the German fire was truly extinguished. Below, comrades began rushing up, calling his name. Merrell turned his head, eyes blurring from smoke and blood, but he still saw the American lines surging up the hill. The battlefield opened, the axis of advance clear. The 2 machine gun nests on Lohe were gone from the field. He drew 1 last deep breath, let his arm fall, and his body slumped forward onto the damp rock, blood from his wounds darkening the crevices, where he had made his final stand. Behind him, the 2 MG-42 barrels now lay still and completely silent. That moment of silence spread quickly downward. A sergeant raised his head first, saw no more muzzle flashes on the crest, and shouted urgently, "Clear, move up." The platoon surged to its feet, escaping the earth they had hugged for half an hour under deadly fire. The slope that had been a wall of flame suddenly opened like a door yanked off its hinges. The Americans ran upward without hesitation, without looking back, knowing the window would not stay open long. German fire from the flanks abruptly slackened. A few snipers withdrew. Mortar crews pulled back in haste. The silencing of the 2 machine guns shook the entire upper defense line in minutes. When the first men reached the edge of the emplacement, the sight stopped them cold. MG-42 belts scattered, ammo boxes torn from mounts, churned earth showing a grenade had detonated at point-blank range. And right beside it, Merrell. He leaned against a boulder, tilted slightly forward, as if still trying to stand. His right hand clutched the empty Luger, jacket torn at shoulder, and side, blood soaked into every fold. A soldier knelt, pressed fingers to his neck, called his name through gasping breaths. Merrell's eyes opened halfway, looking down the slope where comrades were running up. It was unclear whether he still saw anything, but his gaze held that direction a few seconds longer. "The nests are quiet," the soldier beside him said softly, wanting him to hear. Merrell nodded faintly. Or perhaps it was only a final motion. The platoon leader, supported by 2 men, looked into the emplacement, then across the open ground below. Then he looked back at Merrell, an expression mixing shock and an ache too deep for words. The remaining soldiers spread out around the position, checking the German bodies a few steps apart, collecting weapons, sweeping the trench. They began to trace Merrell's path, from the mound at the foot of the hill, across the open slope, around the rock edge, grenade thrown, then straight into the second nest. No one spoke, but everyone was calculating how long they themselves could have survived doing the same. He really did all this alone, one soldier blurted. No one answered. The question hung in the still hot battlefield, heavy enough to silence even the oldest veterans. The medic arrived last, knelt beside Merrell. He opened his kit, searched for a pulse, then signaled two men to hold shoulder and side to control bleeding. Merrell reacted weakly when gauze pressed the wounds, his breathing surging as if clinging on. One soldier took his hand, leaned close and said slowly, "You opened the way for us." Merrell's breathing stuttered, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, as though he had saved what remained to hear those words. While the medic worked, the platoon looked down the slope they had just crossed. Ground torn up, mud churned, spent casings tracing Merrell's run. 3 German bodies in the emplacement. Another collapsed along the trail behind. The entire crest defense, shattered by the single path one 18-year-old had crossed. American artillery below began firing in preparation for the next advance, but the distant blasts could not cover the silence spreading around Merrell. It was not the silence of victory, but the silence of men trying to grasp what had just happened before their eyes. An entire platoon alive because one man refused to stay down. When the medic signaled Merrell needed to be carried down the slope as fast as possible, 2 soldiers gently lifted him. His body went limp, eyes closed, breathing thin as mist, yet his hand still gripped the Luger to the very end. They started down the hill, while the others remained at the emplacement, silently watching the battlefield where a young man had changed everything in a matter of seconds. Wind swept the slope, carrying smoke and damp earth, and in that moment everyone knew the decisive instant of Lohe had been written, not by the firepower of a whole company, but by the footsteps of one man alone. The medic and 2 soldiers carried Merrell down the slope, while American preparatory artillery shook the ground. They chose the most concealed path to avoid stray shots from beyond the trees, moving carefully to keep his body from jostling too much. Blood continued seeping through the bandages, leaving dark streaks on the wet earth. Each time Merrell drew a breath, his chest jerked as if pushing through an invisible wall. The medic kept a hand on his shoulder, whispering short phrases, trying to keep him alert with a steady voice. But Merrell's body grew colder, fading like late daylight. When they reached the low ground behind the hill, a sergeant called 2 more men to help lay him on an army tarp. They rolled a jacket under his head, shielded him from wind with their own bodies, so he would not shiver more. The medic took a needle to start an IV, but the arm was too cold to find a clear pulse. He paused a beat, then looked directly at the sergeant. No words were needed. Everyone understood. Merrell breathed shallowly, eyes opening slightly when he heard comrades call his name. One soldier leaned close, took his mud-caked hand. "The hill is clear. We made it up." Merrell could not reply, but his eyelids fluttered as if he heard. Then his body slowly relaxed, breath shortening, then stopping, so gently only those right beside him noticed the moment had come. They stayed quiet over him a few seconds, as if afraid to disturb the pain still lingering on his young face. The medic pulled a blanket up to his chest, clenched his jaw to hold back a sigh. No one spoke. On the Lohe hillside where he had charged alone, wind still rustled the grass lightly. At the foot of the hill the entire platoon stood looking at the small figure now motionless among churned mud and crisscrossing boot prints. Just an hour earlier, Merrell had been the youngest in the platoon. Now he lay among them, carrying a silence heavy as steel. Word of Merrell's death reached Staten Island after Nuremberg fell. The family received the notification letter on a cold morning, frost still on the wooden steps. His mother clutched the letter to her chest, hands shaking while his father stood beside her unsure where to lean. They read the brief report, giving no battle details, only stating their son died while performing his duty. But weeks later another letter arrived, from soldiers who had fought beside Merrell. They told everything: how he charged the hill alone, destroyed 2 MG-42 nests, opened the way for the whole platoon. The family read each line and did not know whether to weep or feel pride before a truth far larger than the quiet boy who once helped neighbors fix fences. In Europe, the surviving soldiers continued the march south, passing villages, deep bunkers, and the final German defensive lines. But Lohe never left them. A sergeant said that every time he crossed an open slope, he saw Merrell's figure charging ahead of him. A younger soldier said that on nights without shelling he would wake thinking he heard again the shout of "clear" from that hillside. The medic who had held Merrell's head on the tarp said he had never met anyone so young who could make a decision so cold and clear. All of them carried the same feeling to the end of their lives. They lived because of the choice of an 18-year-old boy. When the war ended, unit names were recorded, flags raised, victory parades marched down broad avenues. But in the memory of those who passed through Lohe, that victory always carried the shape of a young soldier running uphill alone against two gun barrels. War creates heroes, but only by taking the one thing that can never be repaid: youth. And when people spoke of Merrell, they did not talk about medals or ceremonies. They talked about that choice, the choice that split the line between life and death for dozens of men, and cut short the life of a boy who had only just reached 18. After Lohe, the war continued to pull the 3rd Infantry Division forward. Then came the day Nazi Germany surrendered. The survivors returned amid cheers, while the name of the young soldier remained on the hillside, gradually fading into military reports. But those who witnessed it, those who lived because of every step he took up that slope that day, never forgot. They retold the story to new units, to fresh replacements, to anyone who asked how the platoon got past Lohe. They simply said, because one man ran ahead of everyone. 1 year after victory, on February 26, 1946, the Merrell family received notice from the U.S. Army. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor a U.S. serviceman can receive. At the ceremony, the citation reader took just over a minute to recount the deed, each sentence drafted cold and precise like a battlefield log. He single-handedly charged under intense fire, destroyed 2 machine gun nests, killed several enemy soldiers, and contributed decisively to the success of his unit. The citation was read in a hall, but the one person who should have heard it lay beneath cold earth half a world away. After the Medal of Honor, Merrell's name was given to a U.S. Navy transport ship, USNS PVT, Joseph F. Merrell. The ship quietly served for decades, docking at countless ports, carrying thousands of tons of supplies across seas he never saw. There is also a valley in Antarctica, Merrell Valley, named for him. A place of white silence, so cold every sound becomes crystalline. The kind of place where, standing alone, you clearly understand how small a human life is. A solitary but dignified landmark for a young man who faced 2 gun barrels alone. In the U.S. military, Merrell's story is passed down as part of quiet history, not featured in big films, but always present in the memory of units that marched through Nuremberg. Some officers mention him when training recruits, not to build myth but to show that sometimes the difference between defeat and survival comes from one person alone. One person willing to step into the space everyone else avoids. The old soldiers, after the war, returning to ordinary life, each kept their own private version of that morning at Lohe. One said that whenever he heard rain, he remembered the earth being torn up by MG-42 says Merrell ran through it. Another said that in his final dreams he still saw the boy on the slope, small enough that wind might knock him over, yet running with the speed of someone who knew what he was doing was necessary. The pain of war does not fade in medals or anniversaries. It lives in those who came home and aged too quickly, and in those who never came home, never saw the world after victory. Merrell never knew he was honored, never knew his name was carved on a ship, on an icy valley at the end of the world. Never knew the Lohe survivors carried his story for the rest of their lives, and perhaps he did not need to know, because his choice on that hillside did not come from wanting to become a symbol. It came from the responsibility of a young soldier who would not stand by and watch his comrades left behind. War gave Merrell no power. It only stole his youth, then placed on his thin shoulders a task that should have been shared by many more. But sometimes, in the harshest moments, the simple innocence and resolve of one young person become the sharpest blade that cuts through the enemy's formation. On the Lohe hillside, that happened. An 18-year-old boy opened the way for dozens of others, paying with his own life. Looking back at this story, one finds no dazzling triumph, only a quiet truth. Some sacrifices illuminate the finest part of human nature, and also make clear the price war always demands. That is the legacy of Joseph F. Merrell, a legacy sad, beautiful, and painful enough that no one can retell it without pausing. If you want to hear more true and haunting historical stories like this, please subscribe now so you don't miss any. Thank you for staying until the end. See you on the next journey.